Maria Zigliara is Summa Philosophica in Unsum Scholarium was an amazing manual, a Thomistic manual that expanded a lot, not just on Thomistic and Aristotelian philosophy, but also on the analytic tradition of philosophy, people like Descartes and the idealists like Kant and Hegel and Fichte. Now, he was a Dominican Thomist, and the sections on Hegel appear in Critica, Book 2, Chapter 2, under the treatment of objective criteria of truth, specifically Article 6, De Doctrina Hegeliana. Now, we're not going to be going into the literal critique that Tommaso Maria Zigliara does of Hegel, but rather a solution or a kind of recognizing of why Hegel reaches this idea that being is purely indeterminate in its immediacy, in vacuity. Now, Zigliara's solution is essentially the distinction between the two senses of indetermination that he deploys against Hegel's syllogism, but taken positively rather than just critically. Now, I'm just going to give you a little bit of rundown. Now, Hegel says that being seems to be indeterminate. Now, this is true, right? In a sense, because if you was to apply being to a genus, being would be indeterminate, right? But the thing is that when you say stuff like that, well, its indetermination is the negation of a specific generic or individual mode of determination. It's not the negation of the entitative content as such. Now, being is indeterminate in the sense that it's not this or that kind of being, right? It's not a species, it's not a genus, not an individual. But this indetermination itself is a positive thing. It is a transcendental reach of ends precisely as ends, which is why Aquinas insists that being is not a genus. A genus is indeterminate relative to its species, but being's indetermination is of a wholly different order. It's not a container that's just being waited to be filled, but the act by which anything is, whatsoever at all. So the apparent emptiness of pure being is, for Zigliara, a function of abstraction being confused with privation. When we abstract ends from all its particular modes, we are left with nothing. We are left with the actus essendi, as such, which is maximally positive, not maximally empty. The indetermination points upwards towards the fullness of esse, rather than downward to nullity. Now, this is why Zigliara says that the closer we approach pure being, the closer we approach its indeficiency, in its inexhaustibility in relation to positivity, that can't fall or lapse into non-being. Now, the reference point is, of course, Aquinas' doctrine of the esse, and that the esse is actually the actuality of all acts and the perfection of all perfections. Indetermination at the transcendental level is not poverty, but superabundance. It is what is, or at least precisely, the case because no finite determination can exhaust it. Now, Hegel reads the indetermination of pure being as emptiness because he's already working with a concept of being as a genus-like abstraction, which is exactly what Aquinas and Aristotle deny being is. Take a simple example. Imagine you strip away every specific feature from a particular thing, say a dog. You remove its colour, its breed, its size, its temperament, everything particular about it. You might think that you're left with nothing, or at least nearly nothing. Now, Hegel essentially takes this view. If you strip away everything, and you arrive at this pure, indeterminate emptiness, which is therefore the same as nothing. But Zigliara's point is that what you're actually left with is the fact that it exists, its sheer actuality, that it is prior to any what it is. Now, that's not nothing. That's the most fundamental positive thing about it. The dog's existence, the bare act of it being there at all, is not emptied out by removing its colour or breed. If anything, you've isolated something more basic and more positive than any of those features put together, because all those features depend on it. Redness depends on there being something to be red. Existence does not depend on anything in that way, it's what everything else leans on. So when being appears maximally indeterminate, Zigliara's point is that this apparent emptiness is actually a sign that you've reached something that no finite determination can capture. Not because it's hollow, but because it's too full. It's indeterminate the way light is colourless, not because it lacks colour, but because it contains the condition for all colour. Now, Hegel reads the indetermination as this poverty, but Aquinas reads it as this inexhaustible positivity. And that's the difference. Now, the question that kind of needs to be asked, and Zigliara doesn't fully escape it on his own terms, but he establishes that pure being isn't equivalent to nothing, that indetermination, secundum quid, is an absolute negation. But he doesn't by himself give you a robust account of why the actus essendi is positively determinate, rather than just slightly less empty abstraction than Hegel's version. The full answer has to come from the real distinction between esse and essentia. Existence isn't a thin logical predicate that just floats around freely. It's always the existence of something, the act by which a determinate essence is actualized. So esse is never actually encountered in pure isolation, it's intrinsically relational to essence, even if it's really distinct from it. So the apparent indetermination of pure being as a concept is an artifact of abstraction. In reality, existence is always thick, it's always the actualization of some nature. But this, in a sense, concedes something to Hegel's challenge. If esse is only genuinely indeterminate in its concrete union with the essence, then pure being as a starting point for logic is, well, in some sense, an abstraction that doesn't fully stand on its own, which is close to what Ulrich says, and even closer to what Schelling is saying. Now, Zigliara isn't the only one to point this kind of thing out, but actually, Henri Grenier in his Thomistic manual actually points out something very, very interesting. Now, Grenier opens up the problem with very interesting insights. He quotes Hegel's own words from The Science of Logic, that pure being is its indeterminate immediacy in vacuity, and that being indeterminate immediacy simply is nothing. And then he frames this as the natural terminus of treating being as a pure abstraction. If you approach being as something arrived at by stripping all the terminations away, well, you will indeed end up with the apparent emptiness. Now, Grenier's response is that this entire approach misunderstands what kind of concept being is. Being is not a genus, like Zigliara says, and like Aquinas says, and Aristotle, that it's going to achieve its generality by extracting away differentiating content. It's not like that. Being is a transcendental, and the transcendental is precisely that which is found really intrinsically and formally in all things, including everything by which they are not merely similar, but distinct. And this crucial point that Henri Grenier says is very interesting. Now, a genus is general because it excludes its differentiae. So if I took, for example, animal, right, that achieves its generality by being indifferent to rational and irrational, which are external to it. Being cannot work this way, because if the differentia by which being is contracted were extraneous to being, well, they would themselves be nothing. So whatever makes things distinct, whatever contracts being into this kind of being rather than that kind of being, is itself formally being. Being's indetermination is therefore not an indetermination of a container waiting to be filled, like I mentioned before, but it already contains its differentiations, not as potentiality, as a genus does, but what Grenier calls actu confuso, actually, but in a confused manner, as notions intrinsic to itself. Now, this leads directly to Grenier's thesis that being is analogous, specifically analogous by analogy of proper proportionality, not univocal and not equivocal. This is why, or where the solution to the apparent indetermination becomes fully explicit. Being appears indeterminate if you assume it must either be univocal, well, flat, or identical content just spread across all things, or equivocal, a mere name for completely different things. Univocity would produce Parmenides or Spinoza, that one undifferentiated being, since differentiate would have to come from outside being, well, therefore, it would be nothing. Equivocity would produce agnosticism, no real cognitive bridge between the finite and infinite being, the substance and the accident. So the analogical solution says that being signifies a perfection that is found intrinsically and properly in all its inferiors, but according to the modes that are only proportionally the same. Infinite being is being whose essence and existence are identical. Finite being is being in which essence and existence are really distinct. Substance possesses existence in itself. Accident possesses existence dependently in a subject. Each of these is genuinely being, not merely named so by extrinsic denomination, but according to the essential different mode. Now, the concept of being is therefore not an empty abstraction, but it's much more than an empty abstraction, right? But it's a concept that's incompletely precedent, containing its differentiations in a confused act rather than leaving them outside itself as a genus does. Now, like I spoke about superabundance before, the third move that Grenier makes is virtually multiple superabundance. Grenier makes the further positive claim that being is virtually multiple and superabundant, which is why it cannot be exhausted by a single concept, but but gives rise to the transcendental properties like unity and truth, goodness, thing, and otherness. And these aren't just additions that are made to be or being from the outside, as a differentiator is added to a genus, but the general modes of being that result from being as being, distinct from it only by the distinction of reason. Being is not indeterminate because it is empty, but because it is too full to be captured in any single expressed concept. The apparent indetermination is a shadow cast by the inexhaustible positivity. Now, the direct answer really is therefore this. Hegel's pure being is indeed indeterminate in the way Hegel describes it, but only because Hegel has already treated being as a genus, like Zigliara says. Now, this is very interesting, because now this gets you to the point of, well, which one is right? Why should we accept all the Aristotelian stuff? Well, we should accept all the Aristotelian things because I say so. Thanks for watching the video. Peace.